This is Austin Liti Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Matt Bell. Matt is an author of fiction and nonfiction and a creative writing instructor at Arizona State University. He's published 3 novels. The most recent, Appleseed, was a New York Times notable book. He's also published numerous short stories. This episode will appeal particularly to writers, as Scott and Matt talk about creativity and craft with insight from Matt's latest book about writing, Refuse to be Done.
Welcome to the show, Matt Bell.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
You're welcome. So before we get started, I want to congratulate you on Appleseed, a New York Times notable book that came out last summer, and Refuse to be Done, a book page starred review that says deserves a spot on every writer's desk. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's been a lucky year.
Yeah, you hit a double that last year. You had a fiction book and a nonfiction book come out. I mean, that must be a good feeling.
Yeah, it's been an interesting thing. My last 2 novels, I've written like a short nonfiction book in between. So I don't know if that will be the pace forever, but it's been sort of an interesting sort of 1-2-1-2 kind of thing for the last, 6 or 7 years. Yeah,
exactly. Wow. So your most recent book, Refuse to be Done, which I have here on Kindle. Which do you like to read better, on ebooks or paper books, before I get started?
I do both. I'm very agnostic. I read a lot of audiobooks. I've sort of, in all forms, have books coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I love it all. So in your book, Refuse to be Done, you describe 3 distinct writing phases. So there's the generative revision, narrative revision, and polishing revision. But in your own writing career, have you always been so organized with these kind of distinct phases?
No, although I probably wouldn't have minded being so. I really figured out, the first version of this sort of process that's in Refuse to be Done when I was writing my first novel that got published, In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods. But I wrote 2 novels before that, neither of which I really even showed anybody. They're both kind of like peer drawer novels. I wrote a NaNoWriMo novel in like 2004, 2005. And then I wrote a novel right before I went to grad school, so like 2008. That I sort of knew weren't going to be publishable novels, for various reasons. Some of it was just like they were clearly not as good as other things. But I think I didn't really know how to revise a novel, and when I was writing short stories and publishing just short stories, like in grad school, I just sort of like brute force it, right? You get some feedback and you try some different things, and you sort of, as you learn new things, you made the story a little better. But they were small enough that seemed, like an okay way to do things. And then as soon as I got that first draft of In the House, I had this sort of like, what now moment, and sort of didn't know really how to proceed. And so the very earliest material that became Refused to be Done was just like me learning how to revise a novel. Some of the things in the book, like I know we're going to talk about like retyping the second draft, kind of entirely, really were first tried there. And then we're so successful, I sort of, continued to sort of build on those things as I went forward.
Right. So writer Fernando Flores made a comment about comparing short stories to novels, where short stories are kind of like a magic trick and a novel is like an extended illusion. Have you heard this quote from him before? So you were talking about early on, you're writing short stories, you kind of just went through them in brute force. Is that because, the length of a novel, it's hard to sustain brute force writing for a career, right?
Yeah. I think some of it is, I think there's like a limit to how much prose you can hold in your head at once and sort of see the whole picture. And I think for me, it's like 30 to 40 pages. I think that number is pretty common. And that's, like a really long short story. Like I have 12,000 word short stories, so like the longest short story you could write would be about 40 pages. And when I'm working in that length, I can make a change on page like 35 and kind of know what it's doing on page 5, right? But in a novel, especially while I'm drafting, most of the book is kind of a mystery to me at any given time, right? I'm sort of remembering that size of a chunk. And so some of the revision tactics are really ways of like touching more of the book more often so that you can hold more of it in your brain. There's a part for me late in like the drafting process. I usually write like 2-3 hours a day. That's a good writing day for me. Late in the process, I'll try to write really long days so I just can see more of the book. And that phase is always the part where I'm like a writer in like a movie, right? Where I'm like a little bit insane. I'm kind of floating. Not a lot of fun to be around, and it's really just like I'm completely immersed in the book so that I can do that thing where I can change something on page 400 and know what it's doing on page 40. But I can't do that very long. I think a lot of what's in the draft of the novel I'm writing now is kind of a mystery to me. I scroll through it and I'm like, oh yeah, that happens. That's a wild thing, but it is hard to do that. And so I think breaking the novel revision into smaller tasks is really just a way of like making it achievable. Trying to make 300 pages good is an impossible task, in the same way that writing 300 pages is kind of an impossible task.
Right. So of those 3 stages, let's say we're in Marie Kondo world, we're organizing everything.
Right.
Which of those 3 stages actually brings you the most joy, do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they're all sort of different. In some ways, I find the initial drafting the hardest. I mean, I think that just like summoning material from nothing is difficult. It's fun, but it's difficult. The second stage, it tends to be the one that feels the most like what I think writing a novel feels like. There's something about that always, when I get done with that draft, I'm like, I wrote a novel. When I get done with the third and final draft, I'm like, I'm tired,
Right.
But there is like a real pleasure to the like mechanics of late stage revision where you're just like making it the tightest it can be. I think for me, my novels become something that looks like a book on the shelf very late in the process. It seems like something that happens in like the last couple months of work and maybe 3 years of writing or something. But that second draft feels like the real magic in some ways, the where you kind of take the exploration of the first draft and really make the best version of it. I find that very exciting.
Right. So why do you think that the Eureka moments that a writer has is kind of like the celebrated part in pop culture? You mentioned like,
Sure.
and not necessarily the craft part of it. Why do you think that is?
I mean, some of it's probably because they're easier to talk about, right? They're just like, it's like, where did this idea come from? Is like as a more the kind of flash part of it seems really interesting. The like, I moved the commas around for 6 months and a really laborious thing is like just not that encouraging of a story. So it's probably because it's not very flashy, right? And I think in some ways that's one of the surprises. I think when you get better at revision is like a lot of the stuff that really makes the book great is not related to the Eureka moment, but is doing work that's just as good. I mean, it's really exciting for me to see the effect that has. But it does seem like it's easier to talk about where you got the initial idea and like the personal stuff that sort of comes from. I know when my agent talks to me about a book I'm writing, he always asks me like, where did this come from? And I always think he means like, where to get the idea, but he really means like, where is this coming from in me? Like, what's the story you tell about it? And I think some of that's just people want to hear the personal. I think when you go have a good meal at a restaurant, like you're curious about how it was made, but you're more interested maybe like where the ingredients came from than like how the stuff was tweezered onto the plate or something, right? Like the craft is not always the most interesting part of the story.
Sure. I had a conversation with Dean Bekopoulos a few months ago, and he and I were discussing what the popular notion of like a writer's desk would be, right? Wood desk, cat on your lap, maybe a pipe.
Right. Sure.
When in reality, particularly for me, my writing time is in conference rooms, in the seat of my car, in a library, in places that aren't very romantic. What's a typical writing space like for you?
Yeah, I do maybe 90% of my writing in my home office, which I'm in right now. So most of it happens there. And then I do a lot of revising. I can't really draft outside of the house. Like I'm just too distracted. I'm not a like coffee shop kind of writer. But I do like revising outside of the house. So sometimes I'll take pages and go work somewhere. When I was revising my last novel, it was like deep pandemic, and I felt very much the loss of like the romance of sitting at a bar rail with a beer on a Wednesday afternoon working on my book, But most of it happens here. I think one of the things that it took me a minute to understand as a kid or a younger writer was that like deep normality and routine actually allows me to be creative and to be sort of like weird and on the page. And so I do write about the same time most days in the same place. I'm on my third iMac that looks exactly the same as the other ones I've wore out, you know. So
Right.
it's not the most exciting thing. I think the actual tools of the trade for me are like, I just want them to work the same every time I sit down, that that they can be kind of invisible. That's actually really useful to me.
I think there's something to be said about the routine of things, particularly with me. I think I relate to what you're saying. So I think of the last 3 books that I've written, my routine was I'd go for a walk, I'd think about plot points, I'd get back, I'd eat some lunch, I'd write for an hour, hour and a half. And I did that over and over and over and over. Yeah. And it allowed me to get into that headspace. Because I've had people ask, you know, how do you write a novel in 6 months, which that initial draft took about 6 months. And so I just kind of got in this repeated mode. Certain music would recall that. Going on walks would recall that. Is that something similar? Does that speak to you?
I remember when I was traveling a lot at one point while I was writing my second novel, and I had like a playlist that was like a portable office, right? Like if I put that on, it like almost like a trance. It just put you in sort of writing mode. I mean, I think the same thing. Like by doing it in a routine kind of way, my brain stays really sort of on it. I can feel when I went up for my run before we were talking today. This is normally when I'd be writing, and my brain's the same way, starting to think about it already. I sort of feel like an idea or two. There's something to sit down with when I get back. And I think even not so much now because the pandemic means my wife and I are both working from home, but I used to have these kind of long days by myself at home, and you just stay in your own like little brain space for a long time. For me, I have to write before I do other things for the most part. Like once I'm in the world, once I'm answering email, I'm in conversation or I'm teaching or something, it's very hard for me to get back into like my interior space. So I try to get as much done as I can before I sort of enter the rest of the world. And that seems to help. But ideally, if I can keep my routines, I'm a really, really happy sort of person. It also makes, I don't know if this is the same for you, but it makes me feel more like myself as well. Like I think reading and writing every day is part of how I prop myself up. Like I think when I'm not reading good books, I don't have time to write, I start feeling very like thin as a person. And I always kind of wonder, like, is there something wrong with me? Do other people just feel okay all the time? And I need this like constant like influx of like imagination just to like be like interesting even to myself. But there does seem to be some truth to that I feel diminished if I'm not getting my writing or reading time in.
Right. So Joe King said something once that if he had to choose between writing and reading in a particular day, he would choose reading. Yeah. What do you feel about that comment?
Yeah, I think, certainly in a particular day, sometimes I've probably chosen writing, but it was like an overall vibe. If it was one or the other, I would, be a reader instead of a writer. I mean, I think, well, for one thing, I can't really write if I'm not reading well. Like I think a lot of the like want to write or the ability to write comes from reading good books while I'm doing it. So I wouldn't be able to only be a writer, so that's easy. But I really think a lot of my wanting to write is reader based. Lane Scarry talks about in her book on beauty, like seeing a beautiful sunset makes you want to make a painting of a beautiful sunset. I think there is like a real reader response part of writing for me, that I'm really trying to write the kinds of books that I love, but in my way, right? That feels very in conversation with other books. That without that, I don't think it wouldn't even occur to me to try. I don't think I start out as I have something to say and the world must hear it. Like that's just not the initial impulse for me.
Right. So what's the last book that's saying to you in that way, where you were just like, God damn it, I got to write, I got to do something because that book was so great?
Oh, sure.
What was the last one?
I mean, I think I'm always reading stuff that's making me think that. I'm thinking what I'm reading right now. I'm reading, I'm not going to be able to, it's not sitting next to me, so I won't be able to do it from the top of my head. I'm reading a book called At the Edge of the World right now by a Japanese writer that I'm really enjoying, that, felt the same like push to the desk. I've been thinking a lot about a book I read at the end of last year called Strange Beasts of China by a writer, Yan Gi. Really fantastic, strange book that really, kind of stuck in my head. I just finished Eugene Martin's new novel, Pure Life, who's been one of my favorite writers forever. It's really great to be with his sort of prose again. But in some ways, like everything kind of makes you want to write if it's good at all. And so it is. I feel like a very agnostic reader. Like I read across a lot of genres, read a lot of eras. And it feels exciting to sort of be in touch in that way. I've got one of China Mabel's books on the desk that I've been thinking about a lot, sort of sitting next to me while I'm writing. Ursula Gwyn's work, I'm always sort of dipping back into in the last couple of years, someone I feel like very deeply in conversation with all the time. So it's nice to sort of feel surrounded by your sort of friends. This, you can't really see, you can see the one behind me, but my office is like wall-to-wall bookshelves, almost no other decorations. It's really maybe like a bad look from a home decor way. But I had an office in another house where it didn't have room really for my bookshelves. They were in like a library in the house. And I remember having trouble writing there, just not like being surrounded by the books that mattered to me. So I'm a little cocooned in them here, but it seems okay. It seems nice to be able to look up and see the books that matter to you while you're working.
Right. So have you revisited books from when you were younger to see if they still touch you in the same way? For instance, I watched a great documentary on Kurt Vonnegut, and I loved Kurt Vonnegut in my 20s because when I got out of college, I had never read him before, and I had been studying Victorian Lit, and reading his books was such an eye-opener because he was so irreverent and the style was so different than some of this old stuff. And so I made a pact that I was going to read as many Vonnegut books as I could. And I discovered that I didn't really like some of them like I remembered. Sure. And I also had this epiphany that not all of a writer's books can sing to you and be great. So have you revisited books from when you were younger, the ones that sang to you when you were a teenager in your 20s, to see if they do? And what was the outcome of some of those?
Yeah, I would say more often than not, they hold up in some way. Sometimes there's things that don't. And of course, there's you bring your sort of modern lens to them. There's things that age badly in different ways. I actually reread a bunch of the Vonnegut books I liked most last year because on a panel about Vonnegut, and I thought I'll jam some back in my head, and I reread Bluebeard and the Slaughterhouse-Five and Galapagos and some of the ones that I'd really liked. And it was nice to be in touch with that again. I think I do quite a bit of that. I think one of my goals in some ways, I think, is to write a book in like every genre I love, in my way. And a lot of that is about like books you loved when you were younger. At the beginning of the pandemic, I reread Stephen King's Dark Tower books, which I had loved, I guess from teenager through like my mid 20s, because they came out over such a long period of time. When I read them probably over 10 years the first time. That was supposed to last me all of the pandemic because they were 4,300 pages long. And I'm like, this won't last that long. But it was kind of wild to be back in touch with them and to see how much of them I remembered, like huge chunks of them that I remembered like in great detail, and to find moved by them in different ways. And of course, something like King writing of both young people and older people, you're in a different position now than you were when you were reading them when you were young, I reread it a couple of years ago and the movies came out. And when I read the first time, it'd been the age of like the characters are in the childhood part. And I was exactly the age they are in the adult part when I reread it. And I was like, oh, weird, right? Like I sort of I've had the two prime experiences of this book. So. All
right. Well, now is the time of the show for our lightning round. It's 10 questions. Right. It's a concept we stole from inside the Actors Studio, but it's not their concept. They stole it from Bernard Pivot. They stole it from Marcel Proust. It's been stolen from a lot of people. So, Matt Bell, are you ready for the lightning?
All right. Let's try.
What's your favorite word?
Oh, man. You showed me these questions in advance, and I was like, what's my favorite word? I don't know if I have one. When I was writing Appleseed, I was writing this like landscape book, and I found out that I wanted everything to be vast. There's just like vast. I just want things to be bigger. But I think, a favorite word of mine really as a writer is wonder. I think that's what I'm really always trying to create. It's like if the wonder exists in the book, then I'm happy with it.
Excellent. What's your least favorite word?
Man, do I have a least favorite word? I don't know if I have one. I really don't. I don't think I have one. I'm going to skip it. Pass.
Okay. What turned you on?
In other people, I think earnestness. I like people who are earnest and really, trying for things in a real way.
Excellent. So what turned you off?
Yeah, maybe the opposite. Cynicism.
Okay. What is your idea of happiness?
I think a happy day is where I get to do things that matter to me with people who matter to me as well. If I can spend a day doing the things I care about with people I care about, that's a good day.
Excellent. Who is your favorite writer?
Probably Dennis Johnson for most of my life, and I think in recent years Ursula Le Guin. I think Dennis Johnson and Le Guin are people I'm thinking about constantly.
Excellent. So if you could be a character from any well-known novel throughout history, who would that be?
That's great. I don't know. Probably someone in Lord of the Rings, right? Can I get an adventure? I'd take that. Yeah.
It's a good choice.
Yes.
What profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
Astronaut.
Nice. What profession would you least want to do?
I don't know if it'd be least want to do forever, but I was a bartender and a restaurant manager for a long time. And when I was first starting out sort of writing, my worry was that I would have to do it again. So nothing wrong with being a bartender, of course, but I did my 10 years. And I think doing that again would be the hardest thing for me to do.
Right. Okay, last question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
I'm sorry.
It's a good answer.
It's a good answer.
All right, Matt Bell, thank you very much. Your book, Refused to be Done, excellent. Appleseed, also notable New York Times book. Thanks for being on our show.
Thanks so much, Scott. Have a great day.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liti Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.